Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Resume Ready podcast. My name is Brian Schneider, and actually I've decided to delay covering your LinkedIn profile and instead touch on an even more important job search topic. On today's episode, I'm going to discuss why knowing your story and understanding how your story supports your job search will help you win your next job. I'd like to remind you again that today's episode is sponsored by the great people at Bradley Garrett Salon on Brookhaven Circle here in Memphis, Tennessee. The stylists at Bradley Garrett believe that self-care is crucial to your personal resilience and that taking a break from the hustle and bustle of life supports your ability to rejuvenate and reconnect with people who care about you. When you're at the salon, they help you feel special, creating a relaxing, comfortable atmosphere focused on supporting your resiliency and reducing some of the stress from life. Whether it's for a cut, a trim, or even getting ready for a big event, the stylists are experienced and provide a wide range of services to help you look and feel your absolute best. I highly encourage you to check out Bradley Garrett Salon on Brookhaven Circle. Now on to the podcast. In his book titled What's Your Story?, one of the analogies Craig Wortman uses to help us understand the power of a story comes straight from the bright lights of the West Coast, Hollywood. Craig explains how for years, movies have grabbed our attention and tugged at our heartstrings because of a simple model used by producers and directors. The model involves connecting an image with an emotion. He goes on throughout the book explaining how the power of stories helps communicate various kinds of messages, particularly in the business world, but also just in everyday life. He provides techniques for structuring and cataloging all sorts of stories that you and I already have from our past experiences. It's a wonderful, insightful book, and I highly recommend it. When it comes to your job search, which I break down into three main components, including your resume, networking, and interviewing, knowing your story and how to tell it are crucial to helping an employer and others understand the value you can bring to a vacancy and how you'll perform well in the new role. First, let's start with your resume and why knowing your story supports creating a stronger resume. I'll briefly cover how your story is important to your resume in today's episode, but I cover it in much more in-depth back in episode 12 during part 1 of the infographic series, Journey to a Resume. If you haven't listened to that series of the podcast yet, I would encourage you to go back and check it out. Your resume essentially serves as an introduction to your story for prospective employers and for those with whom you're networking. You can think of it as a high-level summary meant to entice the reader about your potential to fill the vacancy, compelling her to schedule you for an interview. One of my hobbies is reading, and I often read the summary an author includes on the back or inside cover of the book. If you've ever read these book summaries, you also know they're meant to grab your attention so you'll start reading the book. In a similar way, you want to do the same thing to the person who's screening resumes. You want to pique her interest by telling her some of the achievements you've helped accomplish in your previous roles and a little about who you are so she believes you could be a potentially great candidate to fill the position. Ensuring your resume is clear, concise, and detailed goes a long way towards helping communicate this story. Keeping in mind the candidate's trifecta of low risk, high value, and great fit as you craft your resume will also support telling a compelling story to help you win the interview. The second topic I want to touch on when it comes to the power of your story is networking. From the moment you start networking, whether it's through email, phone calls, or in-person meetings, you're going to be telling someone a version of or aspects of your story. Through email, you're going to tell a very brief and powerful written story to solicit action from the reader in the form of a follow-up lead, in-person meeting, or even a suggested direction. Your story will need to include a reference to the challenge you're facing, which has led to the need for sending the email in the first place. Your goal with this email is to appeal to the reader's emotions and willingness to help you any way he or she can. When it comes to telling your story over the phone, keep in mind that 60 to 80% of communication is nonverbal, which means you want your story to be focused, strong, and include some kind of action or request from the listener. The easier it is for the listener to put into action your request, the greater chance of you having a successful phone conversation. Whether you're asking the person's advice, contact information about another person who may be able to help, or you're requesting a 20-minute in-person meeting over coffee, for instance, keep in mind you have a short amount of time, and again, make it easy for him or her to respond to your request. When it comes to networking in person, I have several recommendations. First, you need to develop a strong elevator pitch. I cover this topic in episode 28 and include several key resources for networking as well in that episode. The second recommendation I have is a book by Marcia Ballinger called The 20-Minute Networking Meeting. In episode 126 of her Copeland Coaching podcast, Angela Copeland interviews Marcia about her book and discusses how to conduct a great 20-minute networking meeting. I would suggest at least listening to Angela's podcast even if you're not able to purchase the book. The bottom line for telling your story during an in-person networking meeting is that you want to create what Marcia calls an evangelist. Essentially, through your story, you want to convince the person to become an advocate for you, so she'll do several things after the meeting, including passing your resume on to others, both internally and externally, bringing up your name during meetings and conversations as a potential fit for a vacancy at her own company, and lastly, you want her to remember your story when she's at some social function and hears about someone who's looking for a person with your potential skills. Later in this episode, I explain further how to craft a compelling story you can tell in person. For different kinds of networking meetings, you'll just need to make the adjustment to your story based on the audience and the available time. The third and final specific type of situation I want to cover today for when it's important to know your story is during a job interview. Essentially, people are wired for communicating through stories, and, as I mentioned earlier, stories allow us to connect an image with an emotion. In other words, stories help people better relate to other people by painting a mental image or even a series of pictures the listener interprets. Of course, the better you're able to tell your story, the more effective and impactful it'll be on the listener. There's a good deal of science behind the power of storytelling, and I would again encourage you to start with Craig's book, What's Your Story? The good news for you is that most interviews are conducted by people, so you'll have an opportunity to tell your story to another person or a group of people. The bottom line is that stories give context to the competencies, skills, behavior, performance, and value you can bring to a new role with a company. Whether you're giving your 90-second commercial about your top past achievements or you're providing a detailed response to a specific behavior-based question, it's important to understand how an effective story can make a big difference in the listener's interpretation of the impact you could have in the new role. Now I'm going to give you 2 examples of how you can share a more impactful story during an interview. The first method of storytelling I'll describe is modeled after how a book is typically divided into chapters. This method for storytelling is based on your previous jobs where each position you held represents a chapter in your story. Through key achievements in particular roles, you have the ability to share your story during the interview by recounting these achievements from each of your previous chapters. In other words, by sequentially moving through the different positions and companies on your resume, you can talk about specific accomplishments, including the results you helped achieve, the challenges you faced, and what you learned in each of those roles. In preparation for using this storytelling method, you have to really know your resume, and you have to also choose a particular achievement from each position to discuss. You can learn more about this method of storytelling in Melissa Magana's interview in episode 369 of the Find Your Dream Job podcast. A second way to compose a great story to an interview question using the method of storytelling is what author and recruiting expert Lou Adler refers to as SAFW, or Say a Few Words. Here's a little more about the meaning behind the 4 letters. S stands for say, which means make a short opening statement to introduce the story you're about to tell. A stands for amplify, which means amplify the statement with some clarifying information to provide context. F stands for few, which means provide a few examples based on your achievement. W stands for words, which means conclude with a wrap-up and summary of the accomplishment. The power of this second method of storytelling to provide a great response during an interview is based on easily remembering the 4 letters for the acronym SAFW. Training yourself to use this method of storytelling will help you during your job interview and at other times as well, particularly when networking. Why it matters. Understanding the power of storytelling and practicing developing stories which effectively communicate your past accomplishments will help you paint a more vibrant picture for readers and listeners. By telling more compelling stories, you'll drive connection, helping people better understand how you can make an impact and add value, giving your job search a competitive advantage. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. For more information on topics covered in today's episode and many others, check out the articles on my LinkedIn profile, a link to which can be found in the show notes. If you feel today's episode was helpful, please consider sharing it with a friend and subscribing to the show. Tune in to Resume Ready next time for more tips on how to add value to your job search.